The room was silent, too silent for a school morning. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan spinning lazily above the bed. Rachel frowned as she glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. Emily was never late. Even on her worst days, she would be up by now, dragging herself to the table for a quick breakfast before heading out to school. Rachel called out from the kitchen, "Emily, time to get up, honey." Her voice echoed down the hallway, but there was no response. She waited a moment, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. When silence answered her again, a knot of unease began to tighten in her stomach. This wasn't like Emily at all. Setting her mug down with decisive clink, Rachel wiped her hands on a dish towel and made her way to her daughter's room. The door was slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of daylight to pierce through the darkness inside. She pushed it open gently, her heart beginning to pound a little faster. Emily lay curled up in her bed, facing the wall with her back to the door. Rachel smiled softly, relieved for a moment. Maybe she was just extra tired today. But as she stepped closer, she noticed a faint sheen of sweat glistening on Emily's neck. The way her body was twisted unnaturally, almost as if she was trying to shield herself from something. "Emily," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She reached out to touch her daughter's shoulder, but the moment her fingers brushed against Emily's skin, she froze. She reached down to shake her daughter awake, but as she pulled the blanket back, she froze. There, spread across the white sheets, was a large dark stain, blood. It soaked through the fabric, seeping into the mattress. Rachel gasped, her breath catching in her throat as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Emily's pajama bottoms were soaked in blood, the bright red pooling beneath her, staining the once pristine white of the bedspread. Emily moaned softly, her eyes fluttering open as she tried to focus on her mother. She looked dazed, her face pale, almost ghostly, with dark circles under her eyes. "Mom," she mumbled weakly, barely audible. Panic surged through Rachel like a jolt of electricity. She scooped her daughter up in her arms, horrified by how limp and lifeless Emily felt. Her mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding in the chaos of her fear. This was no ordinary stomach ache. This was something far worse. "We're going to hospital right now," Rachel said, more to herself than Emily, as she grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. She could barely hear the operator over the pounding of her heart in her ears. Words like blood, emergency, and please hurry tumbled out of her mouth as she cradled Emily against her chest, rocking back and forth in a futile attempt to comfort them both. The minutes stretched on endlessly until she finally heard the distant wail of sirens. Rachel ran out to meet the paramedics. Emily still clutched tightly in her arms. The paramedics moved quickly, their faces setting grim lines as they took in the situation. One of them reached for Emily, gently prying her from Rachel's desperate grip. "Let's take care of her, Mom," he said softly but firmly, laying Emily on the stretcher. Rachel stumbled after them, her legs weak, her thoughts a jumbled mess of terror and confusion. She could barely process what was happening, only that they needed to get to the hospital now. The ride to the hospital was a nightmare. Rachel clutched Emily's cold hand, whispering desperate prayers under her breath, though her faith had never felt more fragile. The paramedics worked in silence, their movements quick and efficient, but their somber expressions only deepened the pit of fear in Rachel's stomach. At the hospital, everything moved in a blur. Nurses and doctors swarmed around Emily, wheeling her away from Rachel's grasp before she could even process what was happening. She stood in the sterile hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to make sense of the chaos. The sight of Emily's lifeless body being rushed into the emergency room played on a loop in her mind, each replay more horrifying than the last. Hours passed like years as Rachel sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every tick of the clock was a hammer blow to her nerves, the uncertainty gnawing at her sanity. Finally, a doctor emerged, his face a mask of concern. "Mrs. Summers?" he asked, and Rachel stood so quickly she nearly toppled over. "Yes, that's me," she answered, her voice trembling. Is she gonna be okay?" The doctor sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Your daughter is stable for now, but we need to run some tests. There's a lot we don't understand yet." Has Emily been showing any unusual symptoms recently? Rachel's mind raced, trying to recall anything out of the ordinary. She's been tired a lot lately, and she complained about nausea, especially in the mornings. I thought it was just a stomach bug. I gave her some over-the-counter medicine, but it didn't help. And her belly, it's been getting bigger, but I thought she was just growing. The doctor's frown deepened. Did you notice any changes in her behavior? Anything that seemed off? Rachel shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No, I mean, she's been quieter than usual, but I thought it was just because she wasn't feeling well. I didn't think it was anything serious. The doctor nodded slowly. We'll need to do an ultrasound and some blood tests to get a clearer picture. It's possible that Emily could be experiencing something more complex than a simple stomach issue. Rachel's heart sank as the doctor's words echoed in her ears. She had never felt more helpless, more lost. Her baby was lying in that cold, sterile room surrounded by machines and strangers, and there was nothing she could do to help her. Please, do whatever you can, she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. She's all I have. The doctor placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We'll do everything in our power to help her. I promise. As the doctor walked away, Rachel slumped back into the chair, her mind spinning. She couldn't shake the image of Emily lying there, pale and fragile, her small body so still it looked as if she was sleeping. But the blood was too real, too vivid to be anything but a nightmare come to life. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Rachel's thoughts spiraled, her mind replaying every moment, every decision that led them here. The missed signs, the ignored symptoms, the stubborn refusal to believe that something could be seriously wrong. How could she have been so blind? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor returned, his face grave. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she braced herself for the worst. We've completed the initial tests, he began, his voice measured. The ultrasound and blood work show that Emily is pregnant. Rachel's world tilted on its axis. The word hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of her lungs. No, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. That's not possible. She's only 9. I understand this is shocking, the doctor said gently, but the tests are conclusive. We need to discuss the next steps, because at her age, this pregnancy is extremely high risk. Rachel felt like she was drowning, the walls of the room closing in around her. No, she repeated more forcefully this time. There has to be a mistake. There's no way she's just a child. Tears blurred Rachel's vision as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening to her little girl. She had to wake up from this nightmare. But no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the reality remained stark and undeniable. As the doctor continued to speak, laying out the options and the risks, Rachel's mind went numb. She nodded mechanically, barely processing the words. All she could think about was Emily lying in that hospital bed, her life forever changed by a situation no child should ever have to face. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her feet, and she was free falling into a nightmare with no end in sight. Suddenly, she heard hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. She turned just in time to see David rushing toward her, his face a mask of worry and exhaustion. He was still in his work clothes, the reflective vest and heavy boots marking him as just off a night shift at the construction site. His usually neat hair was disheveled, and dark circles rimmed his eyes. Rachel. David's voice was rough, strained with panic as he reached her. What happened? I got your message. Emily, is she okay? Rachel looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with unshed tears. For a moment, she couldn't find her voice. The words caught in her throat, too heavy to speak. She saw the terror in David's eyes, the same terror that had gripped her heart all morning. David, she finally managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. It's bad. David dropped into the chair beside her, his breathing ragged from the sprint through the hospital. He reached out, grasping her hands in his, squeezing them as if grounding himself in the reality of her touch. Tell me, he urged, his voice cracking. What's wrong with her? What did the doctor say? Rachel swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. They they did some tests, an ultrasound, blood work. David, her voice broke, and she had to take a deep breath to keep from falling apart. They say Emily is pregnant. The color drained from David's face. For a moment, he looked like he might collapse. What? He gasped. No, that can't be right. She's just a little girl. His voice was louder now, edged with desperation, as if saying it louder might make it less true. Rachel squeezed his hands tighter, her own grip trembling. I know, but the doctor said the tests are conclusive. David, what are we going to do? David's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for answers in the sterile white walls. He looked back at Rachel, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. This can't be happening, he whispered, more to himself than to her. How? How could this even happen? Rachel shook her head, her tears finally spilling over. I don't know, David, but we have to focus on Emily now. They said the pregnancy is high risk. We have to figure out what to do, how to help her. David's shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical burden. He pulled Rachel into a tight embrace, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become too surreal, too terrifying to comprehend. We'll get through this, he murmured, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We have to, for Emily. They sat like that for a long moment, clinging to each other in the face of the unimaginable. David's breath was hot and shaky against Rachel's ear, his arms tight around her as if he could shield her from the storm that was about to crash down on their family. Rachel didn't know how long they sat there. Only that time seemed to stretch and compress all at once, caught in the gravity of their shared fear. I can't lose her, David, Rachel murmured, barely above a whisper. Her voice wavered with the raw edge of despair that had settled in her chest. She's our angel, our little girl. I prayed every night, asking God to protect her, to keep her safe. I just can't lose her. David tightened his arms around her, his own voice strained as he tried to offer comfort in a situation that felt beyond his control. We won't lose her, Rachel. We'll fight this together. God's not going to take her from us. He can't. But even as he spoke the words, David's mind raced with uncertainty. He had always been a man of simple faith, trusting in God's plan without question. But now, confronted with the possibility of losing his daughter, doubt gnawed at the edges of his belief. How could a loving God allow such a terrible thing to happen to an innocent child? How could this be part of any divine plan? The door to the waiting room creaked open, and a nurse stepped in, her expression solemn. Mr. and Mrs. Summers, the doctor is ready to speak with you now. David and Rachel exchanged a glance, both knowing that whatever came next could change their lives forever. They stood together, hands tightly clasped, and followed the nurse down the stark, fluorescent-lit hallway. The walk felt endless, every step echoing with the weight of unspoken fears. In the small consultation room, the doctor was already seated, flipping through Emily's chart with a furrowed brow. He looked up as they entered, his face carefully composed but with a hint of compassion in his eyes. Please have a seat, he offered, gesturing to the chairs opposite him. Rachel and David sat down, their hands still intertwined, clinging to each other like a lifeline. The doctor closed the file and leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but firm. We've completed Emily's blood tests and the ultrasound. I'm afraid the results confirm what we suspected. Emily is pregnant. There has to be a mistake. David blurted out, his voice thick with disbelief. She's only 9. How could this happen? Are you sure the tests are right? The doctor nodded, his expression somber. I understand how difficult this is to process, but the tests are conclusive. Emily is pregnant, and given her age, this is an extremely high-risk situation. We need to discuss the potential outcomes and make some very important decisions. Rachel felt as though the room was spinning. Everything inside her screamed that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be happening, but the doctor's words were too clear, too precise to ignore. What does this mean for her? She asked, her voice trembling. Is there any way to make this safe for her? The doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. At Emily's age, Carrying a pregnancy term is highly dangerous. Her body isn't developed enough to handle the strain, and there's a significant risk to both her and the baby. If we proceed with the pregnancy, it will require constant medical supervision and potentially early delivery via cesarean section, but the risks remain very high. Rachel's stomach twisted at the thought. The idea of her tiny, fragile daughter enduring such an ordeal was unbearable. And if we choose to end the pregnancy? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to fill the room. Terminating the pregnancy is also fraught with risks. Given her age and the advanced stage of her development, we would need to act quickly to minimize complications. But it's not without danger. The decision is ultimately yours, but I must emphasize that either option carries significant risks. The room fell into a heavy silence, the enormity of the situation pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. Rachel's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. How could they possibly choose between two equally terrifying options? How could they decide which path was the least perilous, the least devastating for their little girl? Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "I just want her to be okay. I just want my baby to be okay." David reached up to wipe away her tears, his own eyes filled with a sorrow he could barely contain. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, though the words fell hollow. "We have to, for Emily." Later that night, as they sat by Emily's bedside, Rachel closed her eyes and whispered another prayer. "Please, God," she begged, "don't take her from us. She's our angel. Please protect her." Emily's little sister, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, slipped into the room and knelt beside her mother. Together, they prayed for a miracle, for a sign that Emily would be saved. And as the night stretched on, with the weight of the world pressing down on their shoulders, all they could do was wait and hope that their prayers would be answered. Resolute, "I understand this is difficult to hear, Mrs. Summers, but in cases like these, it's often someone the child knows, someone within the family or close to it. We need to consider every possibility to ensure Emily's safety." Rachel's mind raced. The thought of David, her husband, Emily's father, being involved in something so terrible was unfathomable. She clung to the belief that it couldn't be true, that there had to be some other explanation. "No," she said more firmly, shaking her head as if to dispel the doctor's words. "I trust David. He would never hurt Emily." The doctor looked at her intently. "I hope you're right, Mrs. Summers, but we need to make sure Emily is safe, and that means we have to ask the difficult questions. Please talk to her. Try to find out if she remembers anything or if there's someone she's afraid of. We're only concerned with protecting her." Rachel nodded slowly, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She knew she had to focus on Emily, had to find out what happened, but the mere thought of suspecting David felt like a betrayal. Yet, she couldn't ignore the doctor's concerns. Emily's well-being had to come first, even if it meant confronting a truth she couldn't bear to face. As she walked back to Emily's room, Rachel's heart ached with fear and confusion. Could it really be possible? Could someone so close to them have hurt Emily in such an unspeakable way? She pushed the thought away, refusing to believe it, but deep down, the doubt had been planted, and it gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. Rachel sat by Emily's side, watching her sleep and silently praying for strength and clarity. She needed to protect her daughter, to find out the truth, whatever it might be. But for now, she held on to the hope that David was innocent, that their family could somehow survive this nightmare. Rachel could hardly sleep that night, her mind racing with thoughts of the day's events. The house was cloaked in silence, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling inside her. The minutes ticked by slowly as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, until finally, unable to bear it any longer, she decided to get up and do something. Anything, to take her mind off the growing anxiety. She walked quietly to Emily's room, intending to tidy up a bit while her daughter slept. The room was filled with a faint scent of lavender from the diffuser Emily loved, a small comfort in the midst of everything. Rachel began picking up scattered toys and clothes, trying to create some sense of order in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. As she bent down to retrieve a stuffed animal that had rolled under the bed, Her hand brushed against something unexpected. Puzzled, she reached further under the bed and pulled out a crumpled shirt. The moment she saw it, her heart stopped. It was David's shirt, a faded blue button-up that he often wore around the house, the one she had seen him in countless times, comforting in its familiarity. But here, in Emily's room, hidden under her bed, it felt like a cold, heavy weight in her hands. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as a flood of thoughts and emotions crashed over her. How had David's shirt ended up here? She held up the dim light, and that's when she noticed it. Tiny dark stains near the collar. Blood. Her mind went blank for a moment, and she could only stare at the shirt, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. With trembling hands, she quickly searched Emily's bed, pulling back the covers and examining the sheets. There, on the edge of the mattress, were more faint traces of blood. Rachel felt her stomach churn as the reality of what she was discovering began to sink in. Her mind raced back to the conversations with the doctors, the suspicions they had hinted at. Could it be true? Could David have been involved in what happened to Emily? The thought alone was too horrific to fully comprehend, but the evidence was there, right in front of her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to deny it all, but she knew she couldn't ignore what she had found. Her hand shook violently as she dropped the shirt onto the bed and stumbled back, feeling like the ground was giving way beneath her feet. Rachel knew she had to do something, but the idea of calling the police on her own husband, on David, the man she had loved and trusted for so many years, was almost more than she could bear. Yet the safety of her daughter was paramount. She had to protect Emily, no matter the cost. With her heart pounding and tears streaming down her face, Rachel grabbed her phone and dialed the number. Her voice trembled as she spoke, trying to stay calm. "Yes, I need to report something. It's about my husband. I've found some evidence that I think he might be involved in what happened to our daughter." The words felt like acid on her tongue, burning and bitter, but she couldn't back down now. She had to see this through for Emily's sake. Within an hour, police officers arrived at the house. They gently turned to Rachel and explained that they needed to take David into custody for questioning. When David was led away in handcuffs, his face was a mix of shock and disbelief. "Rachel, what's going on?" "I don't understand," he pleaded, his voice tinged with confusion. But Rachel couldn't hold back her fury. The rage and betrayal she had suppressed now erupted with a force she couldn't control. "You don't understand? How could you, David? How could you do this to our little girl?" she screamed, her voice roaring with anguish. "You're a monster. You've destroyed everything." Her words lashed out like a whip, fueled by the overwhelming pain that had been building inside her. David's eyes widened in disbelief, his voice cracking as he tried to defend himself. "Rachel, I swear I didn't." But she cut him off, her body trembling with rage. "I trusted you. We all trusted you. And now this? I hope you rot in jail for what you've done." Rachel spat, her face flushed with anger and tears. She couldn't bear to look at him any longer, the man she had once loved, now a stranger, someone she could only feel disgust and hatred for. As the police car drove away, Rachel collapsed to the floor, clutching Emily's younger sister close to her chest, filling the silent house with her sobs. "Why, God? Why us? Why my babies?" she cried out, her voice hoarse with grief. It felt like her world was falling apart, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the days that followed, Emily, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its cause, frequently asked about her father. "Where's Daddy? Why hasn't he come to see me?" she would ask, her eyes filled with confusion and sadness. Rachel's heart broke a little more each time she had to deflect the question, trying to shield Emily from the dark reality that was unfolding. But even through her own turmoil, Rachel noticed that Emily seemed to grow increasingly restless. One afternoon, while the doctor was checking Emily's vitals, Emily looked up at Rachel with pleading eyes. "Mom, can we go home soon? I don't like it here. I just want to be at home," she said. Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted nothing more than to take her daughter home, to bring her back to a place of comfort and safety. But could they really manage it? She glanced at the doctor, silently begging for an answer. The doctor examined Emily's chart, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, he nodded Emily's condition has stabilized, he said gently. Her pain can be managed with medication, and as long as she takes it easy, there's no reason she can't go home for a few days. But she'll need to come back for regular checkups. Rachel let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with relief. As they prepared to leave, Rachel helped Emily out of bed. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of her daughter. Emily's belly had grown so large it was almost surreal. It was hard to reconcile this image with the vibrant, carefree child she had been just a few months ago. The sight filled Rachel with a deep sadness, but also a fierce determination. They were going to get through this. Somehow, the drive home was quiet, the tension of the past few days hanging heavy in the air. Emily stared out the window, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief. Rachel kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of discomfort, but Emily seemed lost in her own thoughts. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Emily's little sister Lily came running out of the house. Her face lit up when she saw Emily. "Emily, Emily, you're home," Lily shouted, her excitement contagious as she rushed to hug her sister. Emily managed a tired smile, bending down awkwardly to embrace Lily. "Hey, Lilybug, I missed you," she said, her voice soft but filled with affection. Lily grinned up at her, her eyes wide with concern as she noticed Emily's swollen belly. "You're so big now. Does it hurt, Emily?" Emily shook her head, forcing a more convincing smile. "Not too much, Lilybug. The doctors gave me medicine to help." Rachel watched the exchange with a lump in her throat. The innocence of their interaction, the way Lily's concern was purely about her sister's comfort, made the situation feel both more painful and more bearable. For a brief moment, everything seemed almost normal, like the way the past few months had lifted just a little. Inside the house, the two sisters quickly fell into their familiar routines, playing with their dolls and laughing as if nothing had changed. Emily's laughter, a sound Rachel hadn't heard in what felt like forever, echoed through the house, bringing a rare sense of peace. For those moments, the shadows that had loomed over their families seemed to recede. The next 2 days were filled with a semblance of normalcy. Emily seemed to draw strength from being home, surrounded by her family and the comforts of her own space. She played with Lily, helped Rachel in the kitchen, and even managed to watch some of her favorite shows without wincing in pain. It was as if being home had given her a new burst of energy, a temporary reprieve from the nightmare they were living. On the second day, the weather was warm, and the girls decided to play outside in the backyard. Rachel, feeling that Emily could use some time to enjoy the outdoors, reluctantly agreed and told them to be careful as she stayed inside to take care of some chores. Emily and Lily ran out to the backyard, their giggles filling the air as they chased each other around the large oak tree that had been a fixture in their yard for years. "Let's climb up," Lily said excitedly, pointing to the lower branches where they had often perched together in the past. Emily hesitated, glancing back toward the house, but then she smiled and nodded. "Okay, but just a little bit," she agreed, moving to hoist herself up. Lily followed close behind, and soon they were both sitting on the lowest branch, swinging their legs and talking about everything and nothing, the way only sisters could. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground as they laughed and shared secrets. But the moment of peace was short-lived. "Emily, look at this," Lily exclaimed, reaching for a higher branch. As she did, the branch beneath Emily gave way with a sudden, ominous creak. Before anyone could react, the branch snapped, sending Emily tumbling to the ground with a sickening thud. Lily's breath caught her throat as she saw her sister hit the ground, her body crumpling awkwardly on impact. Panic surged through her small body as she scrambled down the tree and ran to Emily's side. "Emily, Emily, please wake up," Lily cried, her voice high-pitched and frantic as she gently shook her sister, trying desperately to rouse her. But Emily didn't move. Her eyes were closed, her face pale, and Lily was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Without another thought, she turned and sprinted toward the house, tears streaming down her face as she shouted for help. "Mom, Mom, Emily's hurt. Please help her." Rachel, hearing the desperate cries, rushed out of the house, her heart pounding in fear. The sight that met her eyes made her blood run cold. Emily was lying on the ground, motionless, and Lily was sobbing uncontrollably beside her. Rachel's mind raced as she ran to her daughter's side, her hands shaking as she checked for signs of life. "Emily, baby, wake up. Please wake up," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling as she gently shook Emily's shoulders. The world seemed to close in around her as panic threatened to overtake her. The minutes that followed were a blur. Rachel managed to call 911, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the phone. The paramedics arrived quickly, and Emily was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Rachel and Lily followed in the car, the reality of what had happened sinking in with each passing second. At the hospital, the doctors wasted no time, immediately preparing Emily for surgery. The fall had caused significant internal damage, and they needed to operate right away to save her life. Rachel stood in the waiting room, her heart in her throat, holding Lily close. The fear in Lily's eyes mirrored her own, and all Rachel could do was whisper reassurances that she wasn't sure she believed. Lily clung to her mother, tears soaking Rachel's shirt as she cried quietly. "It's my fault, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I told her to climb the tree. I didn't mean for her to get hurt. I'm so sorry." Rachel hugged Lily tighter, kissing the top of her head as tears filled her own eyes. "Sure, baby, it's not your fault. It was an accident. Emily's strong. She's gonna get through this." But as she spoke the words, Rachel's mind was filled with images of Emily lying motionless on the ground, the life seemingly drained from her body. The fear of losing her daughter after everything they had already endured was almost too much to bear. Hours passed, each one feeling longer than the last, until finally, a doctor emerged from the operating room. Rachel's heart raced as she stepped forward, bracing herself for whatever news he had to share. "Mrs. Summers," the doctor began, his voice steady but tinged with the gravity of the situation, "Emily is stable, but the fall caused significant internal injuries. We had to remove a large portion of the swelling in her abdomen, and there were complications." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "Complications?" she echoed, her voice trembling. The doctor nodded, his expression serious. "When we began the surgery, we discovered that there was no pregnancy. What we found instead was a large ovarian tumor. This tumor was producing the hormone HCG, which mimicked the symptoms of pregnancy, including the enlarged abdomen." Rachel stared at the doctor, struggling to process what he was saying. "A tumor?" she asked, her voice shaky. "But all the tests, they all said she was pregnant." The doctor's eyes were filled with quiet sympathy. "It's rare, but it happens. The tumor was pressing against her organs, which caused the symptoms to appear similar to a pregnancy. We removed the tumor, and we're hopeful that she will recover, but the next few days will be critical." Rachel felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Everything they'd been through, the months of uncertainty, the fear, the doubt, it had all been because of a tumor, not a pregnancy. Relief and confusion swirled within her, leaving her almost numb. Will she be okay?" she finally managed to ask. The doctor offered a small, reassuring smile. "We're doing everything we can. The surgery was successful, but she's not out of the woods yet. We'll need to monitor her closely to make sure there are no further complications." As the doctor walked away, Rachel sank into a nearby chair, feeling like she could finally breathe again, if only for a moment. She pulled Lily onto her lap, holding her close as she whispered a prayer of thanks. The nightmare wasn't over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. The hours that followed were a blur of waiting and quiet conversations with the nurses. David had been released from custody after the police received the medical reports confirming the nature of Emily's condition. He arrived at the hospital, looking haggard and exhausted, his face a mask of relief and guilt as he approached Rachel and Lily. Rachel's initial anger had dulled into a deep, lingering sadness, but when she saw David's haunted expression, she knew they had both suffered enough. She stood up and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly as they both broke down in tears. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," David whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have been here. I should have protected her." Rachel replied, her own voice trembling. "We're going to get through this together." When they were finally allowed to see Emily, she was still unconscious, her body fragile and bandaged but alive. Rachel sat beside her bed, holding her daughter's hand, and David stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder as they watched the slow, steady rise and fall of Emily's chest. "She's going to be okay," Rachel whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The relief that washed over her was overwhelming, almost too much to bear after so many months of fear and uncertainty. As the days passed, Emily began to show signs of improvement. Her color returned, and she eventually opened her eyes, weak but smiling when she saw her family around her. The nightmare slowly faded, and the days turned into weeks. Emily's strength began to return. Her recovery was slow but steady, each small victory a beacon of hope for the family. She was still weak, her movements careful and measured, but the light in her eyes had returned, and with it, a renewed sense of life. It was as if the ordeal had granted her a deeper wisdom, an understanding beyond her years. One quiet afternoon, as Emily lay resting in her bed, her family gathered around her, savoring the rare moments of peace. The room was filled with a soft, golden light from the setting sun, casting a warm glow over everything. It was in this serene atmosphere that Emily began to speak, her voice soft but clear. "Mom, Dad, Lily," she began, her eyes closing briefly as if gathering her thoughts. "I need to tell you something. When I fell from the tree, I saw something. It wasn't just darkness. I wasn't scared. I wasn't hurting." Rachel exchanged a glance with David, both of them leaning in closer, their attention fully on Emily. Lily, who had been quietly playing with a doll at the foot of the bed, stilled, her eyes wide as she looked up at her sister. "What did you see, sweetheart?" Rachel asked gently, her heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Emily's eyes opened, and a small, serene smile appeared on her lips. "I was in a garden," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It was the most beautiful place I've ever seen. There were flowers everywhere, and the colors, they were so bright, like nothing I've ever seen before. The air was warm and smelled sweet like fresh roses, and there was a light. It wasn't the sun, but it was everywhere. It felt safe." David's hand tightened around Rachel's, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. "Did you see anyone there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded slowly, her smile deepening. "There was a man. He was standing in the middle of the garden, near a big old tree. He had the kindest eyes, and he smiled at me. I wasn't scared at all. I felt like I knew him, like he'd always been there, watching over me." Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she listened to her daughter's words. A mixture of awe and disbelief washed over her, followed by a deep, almost overwhelming emotion that she couldn't quite name. "He didn't say anything," Emily continued, her voice growing softer. "But I felt something like a warmth spreading through me. It was peaceful, and then he reached out his hand. But just before I could take it, I heard your voice, Mom. You were calling me, and then I woke up." The room fell silent as Emily's words hung in the air, each family member processing what they had just heard. Rachel's mind raced, memories of the past months flashing before her eyes, her desperate prayers, her anger, her loss of faith. Could it be that this was the answer she had been seeking all along? A sign that, despite everything, they had never been truly alone? Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair away from Emily's face. "You saw God?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily met her mother's gaze and nodded. "I think so, Mom. It felt like he was telling me that everything was going to be okay, that it wasn't my time to go yet. He was there with me, and he's still with us now." Rachel's heart swelled with emotion. For so long, she had felt abandoned, questioning the faith that had once been the cornerstone of her life. But here, in this moment, with her daughter safe and recovering, Rachel felt a deep, undeniable sense of gratitude, a sense that, perhaps in the darkest moments, there had been a guiding hand all along. "Thank you," Rachel whispered, closing her eyes as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Thank you for bringing her back to us." David placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, his own eyes moist with unshed tears. He had never been one to openly express his faith, but in that moment he felt it too, the unspoken presence that had watched over them, guiding them through the storm. Lily, still sitting at the foot of the bed, finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. Emily, do you think he's watching over us right now? Emily smiled a warm, knowing smile that seemed far too wise for her young face. Yes, Lilybug, I think he's always watching over us. The days that followed were filled with a sense of renewal, as if the entire family had been granted a second chance at life. Rachel found herself praying more often, not out of desperation, but out of a deep gratitude for the miracle they had been given. She felt her faith returning stronger than before as she reflected on the journey they had endured. Emily's story, shared quietly among friends and neighbors, quickly spread throughout the community. It became a tale of hope and inspiration, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a light to guide them through. People who had once kept their distance now reached out, offering support and sharing their own stories of faith and resilience. The turmoil of the past few months had left its mark on everyone, but it was Rachel who found herself struggling most with the lingering echoes of doubt and guilt. She sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows that danced on walls, reflecting the tumult in her heart. The burden of having doubted David weighed heavily on her. She had accused a man she loved, the father of her children, of something unthinkable. And now, even with the truth revealed and the nightmare behind them, Rachel couldn't shake the guilt that clung to her. David, for his part, had been patient and understanding. He never once lashed out or blamed Rachel for her suspicions, knowing that the situation had been as overwhelming for her as it had been for him. But Rachel knew that they couldn't move forward until they faced the wounds that had been inflicted, both on their marriage and on their hearts. One evening, as the house settled into its nightly routine and the girls were tucked safely into bed, Rachel found David sitting on the porch, staring out into the quiet night. The air was cool, a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the trees, and the sky above was dotted with stars. She stepped outside, her heart heavy but resolute. This was a conversation they needed to have, no matter how difficult. David, Rachel began, her voice soft but steady. I'm so sorry for everything, for doubting you, for not trusting you when you needed me the most. David turned to her, his expression gentle, though there was a shadow of pain in his eyes. Rachel, you don't have to apologize. We were all scared, and we were trying to protect Emily in the best way we knew how. But I should have trusted you. Rachel insisted, her voice trembling. You've always been there for us, and I let my fear drive a wedge between us. I need you to know how sorry I am and that I want to make things right. David reached out, taking her hand in his. We both made mistakes, Rachel, but what matters now is that we're still here together. We've been through so much, and we're stronger for it. I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive yourself too. Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she squeezed David's hand, the weight of her guilt beginning to lift. I love you, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, and I want us to heal, to move forward together. David pulled her into an embrace, holding her close as the cool night air wrapped around them. I love you too, he murmured. We'll get through this, Rachel. We'll heal, and we'll build something even stronger than before. In that moment, Rachel knew that forgiveness was not just about letting go of the past, but about embracing the future with hope and love. They had been tested, but their love had endured, and now, with a renewed sense of trust, they would walk this path together, hand in hand. The dining room was filled with warmth, the rich scent of dinner wafting through the air as the family gathered around the table. Emily, now fully recovered and back to her bright, cheerful self, sat beside Lily, who was chattering excitedly about her day at school. Rachel and David exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with gratitude as they took in the scene before them. As they joined hands around the table, Rachel led the family in a prayer of thanksgiving. Dear Lord, we thank you for bringing us through the storm and for the blessings we have before us today. We are grateful for the strength you've given us and for the love that has kept us together. May we always remember that no matter the challenges we face, your light will guide us through. Amen. The family echoed their voices, filled with sincerity and peace. The meal was simple, but the laughter and conversation that filled the room were rich and full. Each moment was savored, each smile a reminder of how far they had come. The hardships they had faced were now behind them, and in their place was a renewed sense of purpose and faith. As they finished dinner, Emily looked around the table, her eyes shining with happiness. "I'm glad we're all together," she said, her voice filled with the innocent wisdom of a child who had seen too much but had come out the other side stronger. Rachel smiled, reaching over to brush a hand through Emily's hair. "So are we, sweetheart. So are we." And as they sat together, the warmth of their love filling the room, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, with faith, with love, and with the unwavering belief that they were never alone. What a journey this family has been through. One of heartbreak, faith, and ultimate healing. Emily's story is a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, love and faith can guide us through. It's about forgiveness, rebuilding trust, and the strength we find in each other. This story truly touches the soul and teaches us to cherish every moment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did this story mean to you? Drop a comment below, and let's continue the conversation. Remember, every day is a gift, so let's live it with love and gratitude.